Okay, good afternoon, Helen. We are now live.
Good afternoon to our viewers from all over the world. Today we are having a conversation on strengthening democracy, an activity which is being hosted by the EHON and also the ELOG based in Kenya. My name is Ellen Dingani. I am from Zimbabwe. I'm the programs director for the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, as well as the Electoral Support Network of Southern Africa. And with us today, we have four experts, election experts from different organizations. And I'm going to take the privilege of introducing all of them so that we familiarize ourselves with who they are, what they do, their skills, their expertise, and we also prepare to interact and proffer some questions during our discussion. So first I want to introduce Aisha Dabo. She's the programs coordinator of Africtivists, and she's a highly skilled media and communication professional, possesses fluency in French as well as in English, Wolof and Lingala. She's also recognized as a prominent figure in civil society in the African continent. She sits on several boards in Senegal and around Africa. She also has an expert in civic tech, media, women, youth rights, cybersecurity, as well as branding. She's a firm believer in participatory democracy, transparency, freedom of expression, opinion, freedom of press, access to information. Aisha is driven by the belief that well-informed, empowered citizens have the ability to shape fair and just democratic societies in Africa. Hence, her being in this discussion, I think, will help us to have great insights in terms of what she do and also how she thinks the elections that we have held in Africa this year have been conducted. So we're going to get a great insights in her expertise and her experience from Senegal. And then our second presenter is Ibrahim Farouk. She's the program manager for Yaga Africa, based in Nigeria. He has over 14 years of experience in democracy, good governance, cross-cutting fields with his areas of specialization and interests, including but not limited to social movements, community organizing, and in citizen and youth participation in democracy and governance, as well as gender issues. He has worked and contributed to increasing participation in the youth in Nigeria's political system through the Not Too Young to Run movement, which successfully amended the Constitution of Nigeria. And Ibrahim is a regular contributor to the national discourse through his experiences and appearances on TV and radio, and his opinions, which have been published nationally and internationally. And Ibrahim is also Africa's division's programs coordinator for Yaga Africa. I'm sure we all know Yaga Africa. It's a recognized organization working on elections in Africa. They've also observed a number of elections in Africa, including Liberia, South Africa, among others. Then we also have Bonolo Makale, a programs manager for Center for Human Rights at University of Pretoria. Bonolo is a democracy practitioner with almost 2 decades of experience. Her work is in research, advocacy, capacity building, and her passion is in bridging the democracy gap between the organs of African Union and Africa civic society organizations by strengthening the engagement mechanisms for CSOs in strategically engaging with human rights and governance institutions of the African Union. She's also have interest in academic, politics, democratization of Africa and elections, and she's a prolific writer with publications in prominent media platforms and academic journals. She's also a political analyst with interest in African politics and development. So we are going to get great insights from her in terms of her academic work and also with a number of comparative analysis from quite a number of African countries where she has written or observed elections. And then last but not least is Anne Katurima. She's an election expert a Kenyan, a national, and with over 20 years of experience in working with local, international, regional organizations in East Africa and also regional mechanisms, religious institutions, military institutions, as well as government institutions and civic society. She is a gender expert, an election expert. She is also interested in democracy training, good governance, youth affairs, women in peace and security. She is also a qualified national and international observer consultant, having worked in elections in over 30 states. She's also engaged with the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, which seeks to find African solutions to African challenges. In addition, she has also been part of the AU initiative of silencing the guns by 2020, in line with the Agenda 2063 of Africa We Want, and she's also a member of FemWise, among other prestigious membership that she also holds. So today, that's our panel. And in terms of this particular webinar, our objective is basically to discuss and navigate around the challenges that we have noted, the inspiring leadership, and charting the way forward in terms of the elections that we had in 2024. In a worldwide, there are actually 60 elections scheduled globally, with Africa having 20 of these elections. And so far, quite a number of elections have already been held in Southern Africa, East Africa, and West Africa. So we are going to interrogate these elections. We are going to be discussing what we observed as Africans. The good thing with this platform is that we are discussing this as Africans and trying to come up with solutions for Africa. So we are going to be discussing what we observed as experts, as election experts, and also trying to profile how we can overcome some of these challenges. So my panelists will be looking at the different countries where they have expertise on, and also I'll be giving them some questions. We'll also open the discussions to our audience to also give us questions targeted for the particular panelist or for all the panelists. So allow me to start this discussion with Aisha. I was getting worried when she stood up. So Aisha, I want you to reflect on Senegal. Being a Senegalese, they were in very exciting elections in Senegal, and you are one of the few countries that have the youngest president in the world. And we want you to tell us what were the key highlights of that election, what were the challenges, and what was the role of civic society in terms of their participation, in terms of their responsibilities, and what they did to ensure that the electoral integrity was observed. We also want you to look at what we can do better as Africans when we are conducting our elections, and if you can also give us lenses as civic society and also lenses as non-state actors and state actors, in particular the Commission, the EMB, what was their role and how can we improve that role as Africans. So I want you to look at Senegal first, and then you also look at, I think you're supposed to look at Chad as well. You also look at Chad. And given what has been happening in terms of the political discourse in the context of Chad, the cause and so forth, we want you also to just unpick for us in summary what were the key highlights of those two elections. Over to you, Aisha.
Thank you, Ellen. Thanks to everyone at Aegon and for having me. It's a pleasure to share this panel with Ibrahim from Yaga. Talking about Senegal and having the US president on the continent, I think it reflects actually the realities on the ground. Because the median age in Africa is less than 19 years old and the majority of the population is young people. It's just normal to have leaders actually that reflect what the majority represent. Specifically on Senegal, I think the whole world was worried and us as well, because from 2021 to February 2022, 2024, actually, it was very challenging. We were going through a crisis situation where the incumbent, and as in other countries, actually were attempting, or he was attempting to seek a third term, and also continuously repressing the opposition, and there was a complete state capture of capture actually of all institutions that were supposed to uh, organize or rule on things, or maybe a perception of a capture, because we have the judiciary that was instrumentalized to do away with politicians, and from 2012 when Maki came into power to 2024 when he left, the role of the civil society actually has been major. And here I'm talking about civil society as the rest of, the all members of society, all sectors, because we have the religious leaders that play a great role. We had trade unions, we had farmers associations, we have doctors, academics, artists, musicians. So it was a multifaceted approach to preserve, to save the country, especially on from February 3rd, when the president actually announced the cancellation of the elections that were supposed to be held in February. So that was a big blow to everyone. But there's been a lead up, of course, from 2021 to 2023. And talking about the role of civil society has been a watchdog, if I can use that word, and the guardian, observing, alerting, negotiating, raising awareness so that democratic gains actually could be preserved. Because what we saw with the crisis that happened was the fact that democracy or democracy needs to be nurtured. It's not something that's static, that's there and will stay forever. Because what was observed was the previous regime used every legal loophole at all levels to stay in power as long as possible. And we've learned from that, and our organization Affectivist will be publishing next week a legal review or a legal framework review which identifies all the loopholes that exist and that affect basic human rights, and make recommendations actually for the current new government to amend those laws to make sure that what happened never happened again. One strength of civil society actually was the continuous collaboration and the complementarity. It's normal, not normal, but sometimes when people operate in the same space, there could be some, different in views and approach. One important lesson learned, at least for us, because Affectivist was part of Force Vive 2024 actually, which has been mobilizing everyone since the third term presidential attempt to the election, was to be complementing the others or the other initiatives that came up, like Arsunu Senegal towards the end, and many others actually. We were relying on each other's strength, because the main goal was most important. And here, that's a very, I think sometimes in countries in general, civil society might lost the objective that you have in front of you if you want to, necessarily focus on who is leading. While that's not the issue, the issue, it's bigger than all of us, so we should just focus on that. And the fact that we have a young president, actually, we've seen that it has inspired many on the continent. And many countries on the continent actually have majority of their population as young people, and that has shown them that it's possible, however difficult, to have the young people not he's over 35, so have a young president be elected than keep having the old guards in power, despite the fact that the old guards have put in place a structure that makes it difficult to, you know, um, to get to power. Because until now, what we've seen, most of the young people that have become president on the continent came through a military coup d'etat. It was not, an election. So, talking about Chad, that's a continuation of a dynasty, because we had the Idris Itno, the late president, who was ruling for 30 years, and then he was killed, and his son actually came to power in 2021 through a military coup. At the beginning, people were hopeful, but we've seen actually what it has led to. Politicians have been opposition, strong political leaders have been assassinated. Here I'm referring to the case of Yaya Jallo, who, was just killed a few weeks before the elections. We've seen in October 2022 the violent crackdown that has led to at least 300 people being killed and 100 others being arrested. So we see a tight control on opposition, a tight control on all sectors actually of society in Chad, which is the continuation of what his father was doing. And this actually, the longer a president stays, we all know the more difficult it is to do away with them, because they have their people in all sectors of society. And few months before the election, the main opposition leader then, Succès Masara, was appointed prime minister of the junta. And during the election, he was presidential candidate, and he lost the elections, and he did protest that the results actually were not reflecting the reality on the ground. And if you look at if you look at Chad, and we'll talk about Mali, Burkina afterwards, these or other Sahel countries actually, these countries have spent most of their years since independence being ruled directly or indirectly by juntas, which make it very difficult actually to have a progressive democratic system where it's more borderline authoritarianism, where everything is controlled and where everyone is trying to do what they can actually to stay in power. What we can do better in terms of Chad and Senegal is the fact that grassroots, especially people, need to have the information, need to better understand how systems work, need to understand that those in power actually are there on their behalf, and they're not there, just because they're the chosen ones, that the power rests with the people, and people have to understand actually what you are offering, when you are campaigning to be a head of state. And having these military coups actually, and some people supporting these military coups, shows that the ways in which democracies have been implemented in African countries up to now have been flawed, because of it's not necessarily the system, it's the way the system is being implemented, where there is rampant corruption, there is nepotism, there is biased or judiciary, there is no level playing field. And some people think that the alternative could be having military rulers. And the military rulers in the Sahel have shown us actually that they're not necessarily there for the people, because most of them did promise a short transition period. And what we see now is all of them actually have renounced those statements, are planning to stay longer. They're cracking down on opposition. If there's the civic space in those countries has shrunk further than before. And this is a joint responsibility of those who were there before them, because they created this malgovernance situation that has led to coup d'etats. And also, it's the responsibility of the militaries, because I think the way the military is structured as a institution in code and how they function is completely different from civilian life. And I will end with just insisting on the fact that we still want democracies in African countries, but a different way, or different kind of democracies. That is the way democracy is implemented in this country. We need more transparency, we need more check and balances, and we need more good governance and more participation from the citizens, so that a military rule will not be presented as an example for the continent.
Thank you, Aisha, for that. Yeah, quite interesting, but also painting a very gloomy brush on our elections and also the political context in Chad and Senegal. I'll come back to you, but I also want you to think about quite a few issues to also address our audience. With regards to in Chad, may also give us some insights on the role of civic society. You spoke of the um, 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 you spoke of the continuation of a dynasty. You also spoke of how difficult it has been to have a true democracy in Chad, and the system's structural problems, corruption, nepotism, violence, shrinking civic space. So, with that context of a shrinking civic space, what are you doing, or what are the civic society organizations in Chad doing in terms of pushing for more influence and or a more operating environment that is better, and where they can enably conduct activities that benefit the citizens? Because you also spoke about the need for citizens to have information, who is responsible for that, and how can civil society assist. And then on Chad, I wanted to know also if the youth movement that you spoke about, if they're also part of the civic society, and what was the drive behind, and how did civic society organizations like yourselves help the youth movement to grow and also to push in for a youthful president? And is there also any appetite now post the election, having a young president? Is there appetite for legal reforms that you spoke about, electoral reforms in particular? Is the incumbent and the government interested in putting reforms that will usher in a level playing field, freedoms that you spoke about, and also human rights? So is there appetite for that? Thank you so much. I'll come back to you, and if you can just prepare on those questions. I'll go to Ibrahim Farouk from Yaga, Africa. Hello, my brother. Nice to see you.
Hello,
Um,
Ellen. Nice to see you too.
yeah, nice to see you as well. So, from you again, we also want you to talk about what has been happening in West Africa, the elections that we have had in West Africa so far, in terms of what has been the key highlights of those elections. I know there was Mauritania, there's Burkina Faso, and also Mali. So, what have been the key highlights of those elections? And then again, I'll also pose a few questions just to go deeper in terms of our interactions and the insights that we want you to bring out. So, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elena. And it's so nice to see Aisha, and some of her comments also just set the foundation for this conversation. Because I think elections in West Africa are always very heated affairs. And if we just think back to a few months ago, we had three major elections in West Africa last year. It started with the Nigerian general elections, and then we had elections in Sierra Leone, and then we also had elections in Liberia. And all of these were very heavily contested elections. In Liberia, for instance, we saw where an incumbent president lost the election, where George Weah lost the election to Joseph Wakai. But in Sierra Leone, we saw where President but returned Sierra Leonean President Julius Bio returned despite the circumstances that we witnessed and challenges with the election results. But earlier in 2023, we also had the general elections in Nigeria. Um, and it was also a very new experience for us in Nigeria, having three major candidates on the ballot for the first time. But if we look at these elections, in as much as there are many differences, we see many similarities. We see things around high levels of youth participation. We see sometimes some level of distrust in the election management bodies, because many times citizens do not, when they do not trust election management bodies, many times this leads to lower levels of participation from citizens. But in 2024, for instance, I think from the first quarter of this year, all eyes were on Senegal to see what would happen, especially with the announcements regarding the postponement of the elections, first of all. But we saw how the presence of strong institutions plays such an important role. And I think the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Council ensured that elections held within a constitutional time frame. I think that is one of the first lessons that is very important for us to learn, not only in West Africa, but across the African continent, because where strong institutions exist and are allowed to operate independently without any fear of interference from the executive, we know that they'll be able to play their roles in ensuring that any unconstitutional attempts, either at tenure elongation or at changing some of the dates for elections, would not happen. We have elections that are coming up in Ghana in December, which are at the end of the year, and there are already a lot of questions around the capacity of some institutions in Ghana to deliver credible elections. But there are also some reassurances from some of these institutions, such as the Electoral Commission in Ghana, for example, talking about the voter registration process and saying that it's a fair process because, of course, a voters register is the bedrock for a credible election. But West Africa is also a very interesting region in terms of the dynamics that we've been seeing play out. First, with a wave of coups d'etats that took place in countries such as Mali and in Burkina Faso that you mentioned, in Niger, and in Guinea. And unfortunately, this has painted the sub-region as a region that is experiencing democratic backsliding, even though many of these countries, which are currently under some military administration, had committed to some various transition timelines to ensure a quick return to democratic rule. We're not seeing that happening, and we are seeing that there is no fidelity to some of those transition timelines. Time and time again, we've seen it happen in Mali, we've seen it happen in Burkina Faso, we've seen it happen in Niger, we've seen it happen in Guinea. In addition to that, we've seen many times clamp down on citizens' participation or civic space, as you could have it. I think in the past few days, with some of the news coming out from Guinea regarding the ability of civil society organizations to register to continue to operate. In Guinea, for instance, civil society organizations are required to register annually to continue their operations in the country. But I think in a recently released document, civil society organizations have been prevented from conducting that annual registration that they normally do. We've also seen, for instance, harassment of pro-democracy activists and campaigners. And I remember when we were together with Aisha a few months ago, I think early in July, there were some of our comrades from Guinea who are arrested until now. They've been in detention. This isn't just peculiar to West Africa. I'm sure you've also been following the case with Namatai and her colleagues also in Zimbabwe, and how they were arrested and just released, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago. But when we look across West Africa, sometimes we can see countries like Senegal and Liberia, which give us reasons to have hope, where we see that institutions work. Strong institutions can also deliver the democratic dividends that we hope to see. But when we also look at some other instances where institutions are not strong enough, and the elections do not truly reflect the will of the people, or in some other countries across West Africa, who sometimes now call themselves the Alliance of the Sahel States, it seems like citizens' rights to choose their leaders, and especially through an electoral process, is not being adhered to. So we have a mixed bag across the West African continent, and it's a mix of good and bad. I think as we have these conversations and as we work in our different spaces, as we share experiences and as we show solidarity, we want to be able to promote democratic resilience and democratic participation across West African states.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Maybe go deeper again when we come back on another round on the promotion of democratic insights. I think we need to also to interrogate what can be our role in terms of that. How can we promote, given the complex political context in most of the countries that you have mentioned, especially in West Africa? I think we are now known as the gurus of coup d'etats, which is also worrying and which also dilutes the value of democratic processes. But we also want you to go deeper in terms of what can we do as civic society and even as key institutions. But I also liked the fact that you mentioned in much detail repetitively that there's need for strong institutions, and with the reference to Senegal, the judiciary system in Senegal, how can we also strengthen that as African civic society and African countries? How can we strengthen our institutions given the complex environments we operate under? The issue of claim down on civic society, yeah, it's worrying because it's also coming out from Aisha's presentation. So we need also to interrogate deeper. How can we offer solidarity from our spaces as civic society? And how can we push forward in terms of ensuring that our work remains important and valuable in the continent, in Africa? And adding countries like Guinea, Niger, I think was also fantastic. So we will interrogate again those countries, including Mauritania and Mali, as well as Burkina Faso, in more detail when we do another round. Thank you for that, for the insights and perspectives of elections from your region. I just want to check with Ian. Do we have Bonolo online or N? Do we have N and Bonolo online?
Okay. Bonolo is online, but she's still having problems with the audio. Maybe just another round for Aisha Dabo as try helper. Okay.
Okay, that's fine. So that's fine. As soon as they are online, please let me know. So I'll go back to Aisha to reflect and proffer perspectives on the questions that I've asked. And we are also opening to the audience. If you have got any questions, please just type them in the chat. So Aisha, back to you.
Thank you. You asked about the role of CSO, especially young people in Chad. With regard to the situation, I just want to indicate that despite the challenges and through the whole dictatorship under Idris Itno, Chad has had a very strong civil society on the ground. And unfortunately, whenever there are crackdowns, actually, there are dozens of people that are killed. It shows the commitment that these people have and the thirst for change. There is a coalition of civil society organization called Wakitama. They did ask actually for people to, boycott the May elections because it was just a sham. And after that, there have been protests, and usually when their protests called by the opposition or by civil society in terms of regarding governance or social issues, you have most of the people actually that are on the ground are young people. And in October 2022, most of the 300 people that were killed during the protest and arrested were young people. Despite the very difficult situation in Chad, you have strong civil society, traditional civil society organization on the ground, and you have also youth organization who are doing a wonderful work in all aspects, trying to navigate around the difficult environment in which they're operating. And I don't want to name the organization specifically because I don't want to put any spotlight on them right now, giving the context on the ground. And also, Chad has a very strong civil society in the diaspora, with whom also we work. We work with those in the diaspora and those on the ground who have been doing a very wonderful work. To advance democracy in the best possible way. You also talked about what was the role of youth movements actually in Senegal, youth organization during the crisis and the change? It has been huge. You have organizations like Yanamar, which is a social change movement that's known around the continent, inspired by the social change movement on the continent and around the world. And you have us also, we collaborated a lot with Yanamar on many of the activities actually we're rolling out, specifically when it came to civic engagement, raising awareness, and creating actually dialogue first so that there won't be a third term. And the initiative was called Jamagan Trazimanda. And then when the president officially declared that he won't be seeking a third term, we moved to Fox 2024, which became a bigger movement that also had political parties within them, but it was a CSO-led movement. And this is an important lesson learned I want to share, and I think other CSOs on the continent will learn from. When you come at a time where you have a movement that includes different CSOs and political organization from different walks of life, so you have to be able to manage and control the narrative, because you as a CSO, you don't have a partisan interest. And when you have these powerful big houses like political parties, easily actually your goal or your missions could be diverted. So with this initiative, First 2024, we were able to manage that. And I mentioned earlier another movement that was created in February, which is Our Sunu Election, Protect Our Election, which was also CSO-led. It had politicians in them, but civil society organizations were controlling the narrative. So that's very, very important. It's important to discuss with everyone. It's important to negotiate. And I want to highlight an important role that a group of people in civil society play that are usually in the background, which are religious leaders. For Senegal, being the Muslims and the Catholics actually have played a role, because we've had outreach sessions with them to explain actually what we are trying to do, because everyone actually wants peace. So they have an important role to play, even though they will not say it out loud. And I think that's very important to highlight. Of course, the religious leaders that are politically tainted, when targeting them as CSO, just know how to go about it. There was another question of, is there an appetite for electoral reforms in Senegal. Yes, that's what the current government has shown. That's why we are hopeful about that. We did publish a white paper on presidential term limits, which also had recommendations on the way forward for Senegal. And the next step actually is this legal framework analysis that we've done. And we hope that actually the current government has spoken on the need for legal reforms, and there have been a consultation session on that in June. So now we are putting out also our contribution and sharing with the authorities to see in which way they can include this. Because for the first time in the history of Senegal, we've had at least 1,000 political prisoners. That has never been seen and unheard of in the country. So that we don't want to have that happen again. And another lesson learned is to make sure that, you keep track of things and not try to say, oh, they're just coming into power. You just need to give them time to get used to the system. No, you have to keep them on their toe. And another question you asked, and I'll finish with that, was about who is responsible for making sure that citizens have the information. I think this is a role that many actors or stakeholders in society have to play. The government has its role. The school system, at whichever level, have their role. Civil society has its role. You also have media outlets, they have their role. As civil society, we play a watchdog role, which is different from the watchdog role that the media plays. The role we play is important because we are actually, most of the time, a bridge between the public and the citizens. We are the ones who go and do outreach activities. We are involved in civic education, voter education. We encourage dialogue. We address misinformation. We are trying to balance things, and we have civil society actually in the bigger group of CSOs have the ability to tap into the most remote communities, most underprivileged, marginalized group of society. So this is a collective effort for everyone. Governments, who are usually led by politicians, have an interest in making sure that the information is not shared as it should. But I think we should lead towards that. And another important recommendation is for African governments in general to be more and more proactive in involving CSOs in whatever they're discussing, whichever department, their civil society organizations that they are, and they bring in a different perspective into the table, at least when discussing about laws or projects they have or plans they have. We are no longer in an era where the government or institution would just close themselves up in rooms or conference halls and decide whatever they want and have society accept. It should be more of a collaborative one. So this is a very important thing, and civil society actually is already playing its role, and the media also it should just focus more on accurate information for some of them. And we need more government, because government actually are the ones that control, they have more resources, they have more institutions, so they should be able to put more resources to make sure that the citizens actually have the right information to make informed choices. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Aisha. Thank you for that. So what we have also noted is that generally I think in many countries, not only in Africa, we have people who cross from civic society to government, especially when opposition governments get into power. There's a question in the chat that how did CSOs resist the temptation of political compromise in Senegal when working in synergies with political actors? So I'm sure you have heard people who have migrated from being civic society to join the government, and some have resisted. So the question is, how have they managed to resist those who didn't cross, or those who have crossed? What is the motivation? Are there any incentives that are being proffered for them to join, or what? If you can just also answer that briefly, so that
Yeah.
we interact with our audience as we move forward.
Yeah, I'll answer that briefly. I'm smiling because we had this discussion in Dakar during the conference with Yaga Ibrahim was there. There was a
Okay.
panel specifically on this question, and I think the temptation is real. I think it depends on what the person. For me personally, this is a personal story. I've had opportunities actually of joining different governments as consultant on the continent, but my passion is with CSO, and that's a decision I've made, and I don't
Mm.
regret it. During the discussion we had in Dakar in July with Yaga, some people actually mentioned that they regretted not joining because they believe that they can contribute to the change,
Within.
and some people were encouraged actually to join the the political side. And there was a particular example, one from Guinea, who was a politician and now is a CSO actor. So the
Mm.
temptation is there. I think it's a personal choice.
Okay, but those whom you know who have joined in, do you think they are still pushing the same cause, or they've changed?
Some with many difficulties, but because they come with a mindset that's completely different from those who are already in the system. And some of
Mhm.
them just give up and leave, others continue to push, or they just give up and be inside. So it's very difficult for them because it's different for those who are still inside, but some will just leave because like it's very difficult to operate with politicians
Okay.
when you are governing.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'll come back to you. There's another question in our chat. How can we leverage and sustain youth movements for long-term democratic change? If you can just think about that as well, given that you have a youthful president, and I think that question is targeted to you. So allow me to call Ain Katurima. She's now online to give us perspectives of elections from the region. Anne will cover Rwanda, she will cover Comoros, and maybe a bit of Southern Africa, South Africa. So Anne, over to you, and probably also maybe a bit of Kenya in terms of insights on elections, what happened, because the Kenya issue, I think, is an ongoing one, given the Generation Z, what we're seeing this year in terms of demos and so forth for economic change and also good governance. So, Ain, if you can hear me, over to you.
Uh, Thank you, Ellen. Um, and maybe let me start with Kenya. Kenya, we held our presidential elections in 2022. And as usual, Kenyan election is an interesting one. Once you vote in, you start campaigning for the next election. But despite all that, we have seen the new dimension that has come in terms of the Gen Z. These are the young people who, for a long time, people thought they're not interested in the electoral process. They're not interested in the governance process of this country, for example. But now they have come and they are now on the forefront and clamoring for change. And the question maybe is to ask, once the Independent and Electoral Boundary Commission, that is the IEBC or the EMB for Kenya, once it is fully constituted, are these young people now going to register and take the vote as voters, and come 2027 August, they cast their vote? That is a question that is in limbo and also out there for people, for us as election observers to come and see. But we have seen a generation that for a long time, they were never interested in any form, in any kind of governance process. But now they're at the center of it, which is even confusing to the politicians, as it were. So it is a wait and see when it comes to Kenya. If I go back now to the region, Comoros, they held their elections in January of this year. And it was an interesting election because the incumbent who now even won the election was the current chair of the African Union. So, as election observers, we didn't expect much difference. But looking at it and looking at the referendum that was held in 2019, it's a game changer in that Comoros having the three islands, the presidency is supposed to rotate within the three islands. But once they changed the constitution in 2019, this one was removed out of question. So it's all of you from whichever island you come in, you have to you fight it on for you to win the electoral seat. And this is exactly what happened. So we didn't expect much change, but we don't know for how long that will hold. Maybe it is a wait and see game in terms of the elections in Comoros. The recent election that now has been held, and this in the east, still in the East African Bloc region, this is Rwanda. And Rwanda is an interesting case. At first, when in 2017, it was my first time to observe the Rwanda election, and of course, so many questions came into play that 98% would vote for a president, and 2% either voted for the opposition or they didn't vote at all. So, what was really happening? Come 2024 again, the same scenario. President Kagame wins with almost 98% of the vote. And now this one makes us even to dig deeper. But what we came to find out is that election in Rwanda is a celebration of democracy. It is whereby the citizens all come together and they celebrate their achievements, knowing that Rwanda has had a very sad history when it came to 1994, the genocide. Now, with the new regime coming into power and so many things that have been happening, the Rwandese felt this is time for democracy. This is time for us to celebrate the democracy as it were. So we go to the polling station in the morning of July 15th, and we find Rwandese are queuing to vote. And the interesting bit about it is that the Rwandese in the communities they live in is very small in that you will even know your next door neighbor if he or she is missing, for example. So here you are in the polling station and you have not seen your neighbor. So, as the elders or the traditional leaders within the polling station, they had the mandate now to call and find out in this homestead why are these people not coming to vote? Why have they not come to vote? And if they're coming to vote, when are they coming? And being an informal sector or informal economy, most of the people in Rwanda go to till their land during the day or morning hours. Then they come and vote in the afternoon. So you find that in that particular village or in that particular polling station and the vicinity around it, people were calling each other, come and vote, come and vote. At the polling station, you find the celebration. They have even decorated the polling station as it were. They even have the Rwandese traditions where they put the calabash or the gourd at the entrance of the school or at the polling station, and people are welcomed in the Rwandese way. You go in and you cast your vote. So with that, it makes what we came to find out is that the voter turnout was very good because now you have called each other from wherever they have come from and they're coming to vote. So for me, that was a nice way in terms of clamoring and calling people to come out and vote. And an interesting thing that came to realize or came to find out is that when we went for the last campaign where President Kagame was now doing his closing remarks in terms of the last campaign, it was a full house. People that day had just dedicated their day to just come and listen to the president and promise that come the day they will go and vote. Then another interesting thing that we saw in that election was that you have registered as a voter. But the Electoral Commission, in its own wisdom, also proclaimed and said that if you have the Rwandese ID, no one is going to deny you the chance to vote. So even if you were not on the initial voter register, you had an opportunity to vote. So this is what now made the turnout and also the the people to come out in large numbers to vote. Another interesting thing was the diaspora voting. Rwanda and all its embassies and consulates all over the world, and there are about 70 of them, they had the voting, which was done a previous day, that was on Sunday. And everybody, including the embassy staff and the Rwandese living in those countries, were able to cast their vote. So, in terms of seeing people and a good turnout of people voting, yes, Rwanda was a very good example.
Thank you very much, Ain, for those insights. Quite interesting. I think Rwanda election, they've set the bar high. I think if you want to link it to Olympics, they've a record, maybe that no other president may surpass of that margin of winning 98%. But my question to you quickly, Anne, can you give us more insights on the role of civic society in these elections, especially regarding the openness, transparency of the elections in Rwanda? Was there domestic observation, and what were the key highlights of their reports, if any, or even international observers, the level of transparency? How did they assess the level of transparency and accountability in terms of openness? And then again, maybe if you can also provide us with some insights on the balance between the need for political stability. You referred to the historical background of Rwanda, that we all know that as a said one is something that we cannot imagine will happen again even on this continent. But where is the balance between political instability and the demand for greater democracy in the country? If you can just respond quickly to those two, then I will move on to the next speaker. Over to you, Anne.
Uh, Thank you, Ellen. In terms of the CSOs, the majority is actually the church or the church institutions, and they were the ones who deployed a majority of domestic observers, as it were. How are they doing it? They're doing it in their churches, they're doing it in their barazas, they're doing it in their local community. And remember, Rwanda has a very, very strong community policy. In Kenya, we call it Nyumba Kumi. In Tanzania, also, is the same name, but they have a very strong community policing, community policing. In that, if you move into any community around Kigali, be it Musanze, or any other jurisdiction, you find out your neighbor has to know where you've come from, who you are, who are your family members. So that strong community policing is there. So when it comes now to the role of CSO, it makes it easier even to do the civic and voter education, because now you will go from homestead to homestead, or you can even call them into a general area for you to do the civic education. In terms of transparency and accountability, I would say the elections were very transparent because everything was there. There were only three candidates, and you could see who the three candidates were. When you came in, you're given the ballot and you go and mark your ballot. A form of civic education is done to you by the electoral staff. So you go, you vote, you come back. In terms of the historical and also going forward, democracy, I would say it is the Rwandan constitution is the one that has given the seven-term limit. I mean, not the limit itself, but the 7 term for them to be governed. And whoever is in at that particular time, he or she is voted by the Rwandese. So when it comes to the democracy, I would say it is a good way or a good form of democracy in that the Rwandese themselves find it comfortable for them. It's working for them. So they can as well go with it.
Thank you, Anne, for that response. Allow me to call Wonolo from South Africa, Center for Human Rights, to also give us some perspectives on the elections in South Africa. In particular, I think the recent elections in South Africa in May. If you can hear me, Bonolo, please, the floor is over to you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I cannot
Okay.
see your picture, your video.
Yes. I apologize about the camera. I'm not techno savvy, and somehow I'm struggling to unlock my camera. But
Okay,
hopefully, my voice would be enough to do the trick. And
that's fine.
I'm so sorry for joining the meeting slightly late. I've just been struggling with a few things. But thank you so much for the invitation and for convening the space to have this very important conversation. Some of us are still recovering from our elections, which were honestly very highly contested. Since the dawn of democracy, I don't think we have seen anything close to what we saw with these elections. I think South Africa is at a very important democratic crossroads, and yes, of course, you would know that the ruling party, well, the then ruling party had a very strong hold on South Africa's politics since independence. But what we have seen over the years is, challenges around state capture, corruption, the consistent reduction of trust in political and state institutions, a very concerning unemployment rate, particularly among young people, failures of civil service delivery. The list goes on. And what we saw with these elections, which was rather interesting, and I always say this because South Africa may be accused for a lot of things by South Africans and even perhaps non-South Africans when it comes to the quality of democracy as it's experienced by citizens. But when it comes to formal democracy, we have been doing, relatively well. But also in terms of how the Independent Electoral Commission has also performed over the years, it has done relatively well. But for the first time, leading up to these elections, we were having conversations around protecting the vote. Which really it's a new and strange conversation that we never had to have. But even a more pertinent conversation that we were having was around protecting the voter, because there had been some concerns that we may see voter suppression and the different regions in South Africa, specifically in the KwaZulu-Natal region, where former President Jacob Zuma is from and lives at, and a lot of there were a lot of some dynamics around the new political parties, President Jacob Zuma's party being one of them. But briefly, I want to reflect that on two things that I think are important. One would be, issue-based politics in South Africa. Issue around the growing voter apathy. And when I joined the meeting, I think one of my colleagues here highlighted, the tension and that we see, the challenges that we see around the growing trend of voter apathy, particularly among young people in Africa, and South Africa not being an exception. I'd also want to briefly look at some of the electoral amendments. We've had a lot of amendments around some of our electoral acts and bills, but also just how, the ballot paper itself looked like. And then conversation around voter education, and specifically how the IEC performed in terms of the administration of the election and the management of the election. Now, as I said, when it comes to this issue of voter turnout and the growing voter apathy, what we saw in 2019 general election, South Africa was sitting at around 66.1%. which was then documented as the largest decline in voter turnout since 2004, when we received or rather transitioned from apartheid to independence. And we were sitting at about 49% eligible South Africans at that time, turning to the polls. But what we saw in 2004 May, with about 42.3 million South Africans that were eligible to vote, only about 27.2 of them registered to vote in February. And then we then ended up having about 20 or about 58.57% of them voting. So our voter turnout dropped significantly this year, both in terms of our own standard of what we saw in the past, but also the global standard. And I think the issue of voter turnout, or rather the lower voter turnout in South Africa, really cuts across young people. Of course, if we are to think about the way in which South Africans are voting, looking at the different demographics, the older generation seems to be voting, particularly older women seem to be voting, and of course voting for the African National Congress. I think it's this idea of independence, really a typical case of going for what you are familiar with as opposed to what you are unfamiliar with. So the African National Congress is a political party that really sits in the memory of a lot of South Africans as a party that help us transition into democracy. So what we see is that the older generation still, offer their vote to them. And then we have young people that actually choose not to go to the polls. And part of it is one, really not seeing or enjoying the dividends of democracy, but also not seeing, the need to go to the polls. An interesting thing to highlight with these elections as well, what we saw, as I mentioned, we had about 55.25% of female voters and 44.75% of male voters. And I think that's something to explore there, because while we have a very high percentage of women voting, women constituted about 41% of, or rather they made the number of women, that percentage of women that made it onto the candidate party list was incredibly low. And I think some of the conversations that we can have here is around candidate selection processes on party level, but also even just resources of women running for office, and of course the social barriers like patriarchy and so on and so forth. So I think one of the things that South Africa really need to think about critically is to answer the question of how do we get people to the polls, and we've not been able to answer that question. And I don't think it's just us, because when we bring this up, I remember a couple of weeks leading up to the elections, I was having a series of dialogues with young South Africans, and they were pushing back to say, look, we may not be voting, but it does not mean that we are not interested in democracy, or rather we don't even see the value of us exercising our political rights in going to the polls. So there's this idea that they can exercise their civic and political rights without going to the polls. And I think we can debate that. But I think one of the questions that we really need to think about critically and answer is that how do we nip this idea of voter apathy in the bud, and make sure that we don't leave an important demographic out of shaping our politics and the politics of this continent. And then in terms of what we saw specifically around the elections, for the first time, we had 3 ballot papers. In the past, we used to have the national and the provincial ballot paper, but leading up to an amendment of one of the electoral acts, then independent candidates were allowed to run. As I mentioned earlier, that this was one of our most contested elections. At the beginning, we had about 181 political parties that submitted their names on the list to contest these elections. But on the 24th of May, we only had about 70 political parties. And that's huge to have 70 political parties on the ballot paper. Additionally, we had 11 independent candidates for the first time on the ballot paper. And I think there's also been conversations about why so many political parties. And I think for me, the fact that we had this increasing number of political parties contesting for the elections, it speaks to, a tolerant, democracy, a tolerant space, and a growing democracy where different players can join in and participate in shaping the
Yeah.
electoral. I just want to briefly, I know that we are running out of time. I just want to briefly look at something that I think it's important in terms of the performance of the the Independent Electoral Commission. I think the IEC did exceptionally well when it comes to transparency and accountability, particularly when it comes to access to information. I think the right to access information, as we would know, it's guaranteed in Article 9 of the African Charter. And really what the IEC did and did very well was to ensure that the different information goes out there. They use different strategies, whether it was social media, local community radio stations, TV, but also this idea of strengthening multi-stakeholder approaches. The IEC partnered with civil society organizations, partnered with social media platforms like TikTok, Google, Meta, to really bring information out there to ensure that we have an informed electorate, but also we know that the dangers and the challenges that exist as well in using social media platforms. Misinformation and disinformation is something that we see a lot, not just in South Africa. So the IEC really made an effort to ensure that South Africans have credible information, and if there were misinformation and disinformation with the different platforms, social media platforms, there were strategies to combat that. I'm rushing through this because I'm aware of the
I will come back to you. Don't worry. We'll come back to you because we also want to ask you some questions, especially on the coalition government.
Yes.
But I'm happy that you have already responded to a question. Maybe if you can just wind up with just more clarification on the issue of misinformation, disinformation, how it has contributed to voter apathy amongst the youth in South Africa. Did you think that the misinformation or disinformation contributed to apathy? And if you maybe just proffer some highlights on that, and then we'll come back to you again. I want to move to another panelists, but I will definitely come back to all of you. So if you can just give highlights on misinformation, disinformation, and the youth.
Look, I wouldn't take it as far as saying misinformation and disinformation had an impact in terms of voter apathy. I think the voter apathy issue is a bigger issue with multiple layers and complexities. It's an issue of the dissatisfaction with the politics. There's a increasing political dissatisfaction, and as I mentioned earlier, also a democratic disillusionment, right? And so it's not that essentially, I mean, there were pockets of it that we saw there. In fact, 2 or 3 days just before the elections, there was something on Facebook that Africa Check dispelled that said, and there were 3 statements here that were pure misinformation, not necessarily but pure disinformation. And the statement was saying, if you are a voter in the past but has since stopped voting, your vote will automatically counted for the ruling party, which is perceived as a corrupt practice. And the statement number 2 said, if you do not vote, your vote automatically goes to the ruling party, which is the ANC. If you are registered to vote but choose not to, your vote will automatically fall into the ANC. Of course, fact check dispelled this. So the way pockets, I mean, I don't want to downplay the power of misinformation and disinformation, but I think it will be a stretch to take it as one of the factors that contributed to voter apathy. I think the idea of voter apathy really runs deeper in terms of how the existing political dissatisfaction and democratic disillusionment among young people, where young people feel like, what is the point for us to go to the polls if we aren't going to enjoy the dividends of our democracy?
Thank you very much, Bonolo, for that. I'll come back to you. We want you to interact with us on the issue of coalition government, in particular, if it has impacted in any way the current governance and also political stability in South Africa. I think there were a lot of scenarios when we were observing the elections in terms of which party will ANC form a coalition government with and so forth. And we want to know if there's already any impact or insights that you can proffer with regards to the governance of the country, and how has we managed to maintain that unity as a country and effective governance, particularly given this fragmented political landscape that we are seeing. Is it the end of DA? It's been swallowed, or it's going to we are going to have a stronger opposition moving forward. So we also want, and then the issue of liberation parties that you touched on a bit, that most of the elderly have more confidence in voting for liberation parties. We also want you to help us understand more and have deeper insights on that regard, given that some of the countries in Africa still have liberation parties, and how do we balance protecting the legacy vis-a-vis pushing for democratic tenets and principles to be observed. So thank you for that. I want to go back to our previous panelists. I will start with Ibrahim. There's actually a question for you that has been posted in the chat by E-Link Africa, that the person wants to understand whether Nigeria has run its elections staggered. Has this made it easy to administer? So in many countries now in Africa, we are seeing harmonized or synchronized elections. It's not the case with Nigeria. What are the disadvantages of having the current system where you have your elections in different times, the local governments on their own, presidential and parliamentary on their own? So if you can just respond to that quickly. So we have opened our comments chat. If you have got any questions, please just type them in. We'll make sure that all the questions are responded to. So if you can answer that one first. And then in addition to that question, if you can also quickly tell us about the issue of electoral disputes and resolution mechanisms in West Africa. What has been the most effective ways of dealing with disputes? You can just touch on one or two countries that you want to highlight on. I think that will also help us, because we are having so many conflicts in our dispensation, in our different political contexts. So we also want to learn, and how can we strengthen the political dispute resolution mechanisms in the different countries and region. So if you can just handle those two for now, I'll come back to you later. Thank you. Over to you, Farouk.
Thank you so much, Ellen. To respond to the question on staggered elections, currently in Nigeria, what we have at a federal level is that we have presidential and national assembly elections, which hold on the same day. So the National Assembly is our national parliament, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Usually about 2 weeks later, we have gubernatorial elections and state House of Assembly elections. These are a more second tier executive and legislative or subnational level. In Nigeria, we have 36 states. In many other countries, they're either called provinces or regions or districts, depending on where you come from. So while we have the presidential and national assembly elections, which come up first, and then we have the subnational governorship and subnational legislative elections, which come up after that. One of the challenges with that usually is that the party that wins the presidential election usually causes a ripple effect at the subnational level. It's almost as if at the subnational level, there's a desire to align with the ruling party at the center. And the reason for this is because we have such a huge voting population, and the logistics involved with conducting all of those elections on the same day is quite a huge task for our election management body. I think last week, the chairman of the election management body in Nigeria stated that the voters register in Nigeria is larger than the voters register of all the other West African countries combined. So I think that just gives you an idea of how large our voting population is. Our current voters register stands at 93 million registered voters, 93 million registered voters. So conducting elections into at least 4 offices at the same time is such a huge logistical burden. We have a third tier of government, which is called the local government. But the local government elections are administered by the state governments. So at the subnational level, they administer local government elections, and each state passes its own local government law that determines the date and the tenure for elected local government chairpersons and councillors. So it's a very different case from what we find in different countries. However, there have been conversations to ask the election management body to hold all the elections on one day, and to ask all the subnational groupings, all the 36 states, to ensure that the local government election laws are uniform and are derived from the from the Electoral Act that we have. I hope that answers the question from eLink Afrique Limited. But the other question, Ellen, from you was around dispute resolution around elections. I think that first of all, and I think we've made this point over and over again, is that where we have strong institutions or strong election management bodies, first of all, would reduce the number of electoral disputes that we have. Once citizens have trust that the results of the election truly reflect the will of the people, would go a long way in reducing electoral disputes. And where there's a lot of transparency and accountability, I think we saw a lot of transparency in the results collation process in South Africa, for instance. We've seen it also in Liberia and in many other countries where they have results viewing portals. So almost in real time, you're able to see as the elections come in and whether they reflect the views of the citizens from across the different countries. But beyond that is also ensuring that where we have separation of powers and checks and balances, especially the role of the judiciary, or in Senegal, like we saw with the Constitutional Court, being able to make those pronouncements very clearly, because they are strong institutions that are not beholden to any other arm of government, whether it is the executive or whether it is the legislative arm of government, and these go a long way. But we also see some outliers, and in Sierra Leone, for instance, we saw a tripartite committee, which was made up of the ruling party, the opposition party, and some international partners who had to come together to ensure that the disputes that arose from the elections were resolved amicably. So while there is no one size fits all when it comes to dispute resolution, especially around electoral disputes, I think the foundation is ensuring that the election management body as an institution is truly independent, receives its funding, it is fair, and it is able to discharge its duties without fear and favor. And the same for the judiciary, which for us in Nigeria, we say the judiciary is the last hope of the common man. So it means it's where you go to get justice when every other avenue has been exhausted. So also strengthening judicial mechanisms for electoral disputes.
So yeah, thank you, Ibrahim. So I was thinking that we're going to somehow bring in the coup d'etats that are now so common in West Africa. But if you can also link that to the question, if you can address the question that what are the prospects of actually restoring civilian rule and holding credible elections, in particular in the countries that you have actually referred to in this discussion. If you can also refer to Mali and Burkina Faso, I think that will also help, because what we are seeing is, in terms of the model, the most common, or what we know is the best mechanisms of dispute resolution, is not what we are seeing in most of the countries in West Africa. So can you just relate that to the coup d'etats that we continue to also see in those countries? And then we can quickly respond to that. I want to bring in Aisha to respond to the question that from William Lukudu. Does Africa need political parties as a vehicle for electoral politics or elective citizens? So, Aisha, if you can just prepare that response to William. Over to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think it's very interesting, first of all, because the current president of Nigeria is also the chairman of ECOWAS. And he found himself in this very delicate situation where fellow ECOWAS countries had experienced unconstitutional changes of government, and he was saddled with that responsibility of trying to bring them back under the ECOWAS umbrella. And I think there was the option to either use a carrot or a stick approach. And
Mhm.
we saw where ECOWAS had imposed sanctions, where ECOWAS had made a lot of threats, especially to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And as a result of that, one of the things we saw was this breakaway, or attempted breakaway, or breakaway in progress. However, we see it, and the formation of what is now known as Alliance des Têtes du Sahel, or the Alliance of the Sahelian States, more in English. Basically, that was Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali breaking away from the regional economic community known as ECOWAS. But I think there's also a place for softer diplomatic overtures. And we've seen leaders from Senegal, for instance, pay visits to those countries in an attempt to have them return to the regional economic community that we know as ECOWAS. I think it's going to be a very delicate. It'll be a very delicate maneuver to bring back these three countries into ECOWAS. ECOWAS on its own, as a supranational body, has felt that it has a right to respond to these unconstitutional changes of government by imposing sanctions on them, and as well as wielding the stick instead of a carrot approach. But I think that ECOWAS has also backpedaled a bit on using the stick approach, and using a carrot to look at what are the benefits of free markets, what are the benefits of free movement from one country to another, and what are the mutual benefits that the rest of the region can enjoy by ensuring that we have 15 member states of ECOWAS and not 12 member states when we have three that leave. Because the situations in these countries are not your typical election disputes. I do not think that we would use typical or traditional methods to also resolve them. It would take a measure of backdoor advocacy, a lot of softer diplomacy to ensure that they can come to the table, have a negotiation regarding what are the terms for their return to the regional economic community, and also the adherence to the timelines that they set by themselves together with ECOWAS for a return to democratic rule.
Thank you so much for that response. I see, Aisha, there's another question for you. If you can also just handle it quickly from Taona, where he's saying, following the recent Senegal election, there's been discussion on reforming the electoral architecture. How is civic society leveraging their successful mobilization during the election crisis to push for systematic changes, especially while the government is still relatively new and receptive to reform? I think briefly you touched on this earlier, but you can just cement and also reinforce some of your points earlier on the issue of reforms with the current government and if there's appetite for that. And then in addition to that, we also want you to respond to, does Africa need political parties as a vehicle for electoral politics or an active citizenry? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll respond to the second question, then respond to Tauna's question. Regarding what Africa needs, I think having political, when we speak of participatory democracy, you need politicians, be they in political parties or as independent candidates, and you also need an active citizenry. You cannot hope to build a democracy without having the two. The failed governances that we've had in different countries that have led to coups, be they military or what is called constitutional coups, are the results of failures in terms of governments, but also not having enough active citizenry. So I believe those two are important. And when it comes to political party, I'm seeing, I won't say more and more, but recently a number of African countries have made reforms to have independent candidates stand for elections. In some countries, only political parties could actually present candidates to take part in elections, but that has been shifting in the last almost 10 years. And I think that's a very positive move forward. And having an active citizenry, you can be an independent candidate, be a citizen, and decide that you have a contribution to make and get elected to make that contribution. So yeah, we can have political parties and have to. Regarding the question about leveraging the success, the discussions are continuing, and there are many priorities in Senegal right now, and civil society continues to engage, and maintaining as much as possible while being non-partisan discussions with the authorities to make sure that actually whatever reforms is being made are in the interest of the people and they're human rights centered. And regarding that, and we welcome the fact that the government, when they organized reform, judiciary reform dialogue, they invited civil society from different walks of types of civil society to take part in that discussion. And right now, there were conclusions on that, and right now, actually, discussions are continuing. In terms of electional, the architecture, actually, the reform of the electoral system, Senegal has a system, electoral system that works for it, I would say 80% or 70% of the time. There's some minor things to adjust. So not all civil society organizations agree on what needs to be reformed when it comes to the fact that we don't have an independent electoral commission. We have an electoral directory, which is under the Ministry of Interior, and the Ministry of Interior is under the Prime Ministry, and the Prime Minister is appointed by the President. So those are the things people are more focusing on, because we want something more independent than having the government, taking care of certain things. And the fact that the Autonomous Council for Committee for Elections actually is appointed, the members are appointed by the head of state. That's another issue, because the last one that was appointed by the then president actually had partisan individuals well, within that commission. So those are the things we are really looking into, and hopefully we will, benefit tap from this before they start changing their minds and make sure that some of the reforms are made. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. But just a clarification there. So the Committee of Elections is the one that is spearheading electoral reforms. Is that so?
No, 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 no. No, I was talking about the structure, how the electoral organizing elections are structured in Senegal. We have
Mm-hmm.
an autonomous commission,
Mm-hmm.
and within it you have members that are appointed by the head of state. And you have an election organized, a body that organizes election, which is under the Ministry of Interior.
Like the EMB. Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's under the
Okay.
Ministry of Interior.
Uh-huh.
So that office depends on the Minister of Interior, who's most of the time is a politician appointed by,
Politician. Yeah.
yeah. So there's an
So,
issue of partiality there.
okay. So who is spearheading electoral reform? Is there like an electoral reforms committee, or is just
Not
civic
yet.
society, the
Not yet.
government pushing, the election commission put? Okay. So
No.
different institutions are pushing
We
for
have the
electoral.
we have mostly some sectors of civil society are calling for the reforms. Some political
Mhm.
parties are calling for reforms. The reform are not yet spearheaded. There are some informal discussions happening, but nothing
Okay.
has been started yet.
Okay. Is there some form of coordination ensuring that you are coherent, you are speaking with one voice, or you are just shooting from different directions?
No, there is a coalition of civil society organizations on
Mm.
elections. You have the big one and you have other ones. So discussions are
Mhm.
happening at that level for now. Then,
Okay.
because we have to agree as CSOs on some points
Mm.
and
Yes,
then be
yes.
able to discuss with government when the time comes.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that clarification. So I want to go over to N, Katurima. There is also a question from Brian Sengeli for you, that while we have witnessed a surge in digital democracy across Africa led by youth um, as the majority players in the industry. However, philosophers argue that the real politics remain fundamentally analog. Much like religion, politics evolve without fundamentally changing its nature. In light of the recent events, this raises the question, would these shifts diminish the influence of civic society in electoral processes? Yeah, I think it meant electoral processes. So, N, I think that's the Generation Z vis-a-vis civic society, if I can summarize that way. So, over to you, N.
Uh, Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Brian. An interesting question, if I may put it that way. And we are looking or staring at a people for a very long time who have not been seen in the mainstream politics per se. But this is an electorate that have come of age, fully and highly educated, if I may put it that way, and also conversant on what is going on. Because in their generation, that is when they are seeing that this road, for example, was allocated these billions of shillings or dollars, but it has not been repaired or it has not come to. It has not materialized. So they are feeling that indeed, if we sit on the sidelines, then decisions will continue being made by other people. But now coming in on the civil societies, and the question that we keep on asking at the end of the day, who is funding the civil society, for example?
Mhm.
If we do now the crowdsourcing, maybe a way to go for us is in terms of crowdsourcing, we fund our own civil society so that the agenda is ours and the agenda is not someone else. Because as long as someone else somewhere is the one paying the piper, the tune will always be skewed to the one funding the civil society, for example. So how can we leverage? I come back again to the issue of highly educated young people who are so conversant with what is going on. It is no longer any other time where you're told that things go as it were. Then we strengthen these young people in terms of the civic education, finding our own processes. And this one, I can take a good example for Kenya, for example. The young people who are now coming out, they're the ones who are funding the process. You come, you put a pay bill number, and people contribute to it. They contribute 1 shilling, 2 shilling, $1, $3, and you're able to put the government in check, as it were. So if we do the fundraising, local fundraising for civil society, we own fully percent of our own civil society, of our own system, then we can be able to change the narrative in terms of the democracy. And we can also put in check whichever president, whichever government that is elected of the day, we are able to put them in checks and balances. Because if I also look at a good example of Kenya, we don't have any opposition currently. So our opposition currently is the young people. Opposition now is in government. We don't even know what you call it anymore. They call it a broad-based government, but the whole opposition, the whole government is in government. So the opposition is left with the young people. So if we do some of these things, we can be able to put the government in check and also the politicians in check.
Wow, interesting. Thanks, Anne, for that. Quite interesting that the opposition is now the Generation Z. The opposition is in government. I think those are interesting insights. So I want to go to Wonolo. I had a question for you on the coalition government in terms of the face of maintaining the unity, the effective governance in a particularly fragmented political landscape. We want to know your insights on that. And if you can also touch briefly on what lessons can other African nations learn from South Africa's transition to the coalition governance, and how can these lessons be applied to enhance political stability in Africa? I think those are the two questions that I want you to respond to quickly. And then I go back to the other panelists as we now start concluding our discussion.
Thank you, Ellen. So I want to start here by saying this idea of the government of national unity in South Africa's political history is not a new thing. So in 1994, after our first democratic elections, what President Madiba did at that time as an attempt to bring some political stability and political stability, having transitioned from a very painful and oppressive system, he established what he then called a government of national unity, where he had President Thabo Mbeki and the then president of the apartheid government, F.W. de Klerk, as his deputy president. And so this was part of the interim constitution that was adopted, I think, in 1993. So what we are seeing now with the current, whether we call it government of national unity or we call it coalition government, I think what is important to highlight here is that this current coalition is not a constitutional imperative, as it was the case in 1994 with the interim constitution. It's rather a matter of a popular imposition dictated by the election outcome. And I think that's an important thing to highlight, that I think if political parties had a choice, they wouldn't actually even entertain the idea of coalition governments. It's a thing of political expediency because of the election outcome, and particularly because coalition governments are a very difficult art to manage. Again, in South Africa, we are seeing this for the first time on national level. To the scale that it is now. As I mentioned, that in 1994, President Madiba established the first government of national unity, which of course was short-lived when F.W. then decided to be an opposition. But we are not seeing this for the first time. In 2016, local government elections, and in 2021 local government elections, at different metros in municipalities in South Africa, the African National Congress didn't have the required 50+1 majority to govern those cities. So in 2016, the ANC lost to Johannesburg, Tshwane, and another municipality in PE. Same thing happened in 2021, and what we saw now in these elections, Gauteng and KZN was also lost. But the point here is that we had to form a government. We did not have, no political party had the required majority to form a government. And so while the ANC did not have the 50+1 majority that they required to form, this idea of a single dominant governance, they still had the majority. So as it stands, we have 10 political parties who are part of this, government of national unity, coalition government, however you want to put it. And I think what it will do, I think we are still figuring it out. As I mentioned earlier, that coalition governments are a difficult art to manage, right? Especially if we are considering issues around political ideology of different political parties, but also policies and so on and so forth. So these 10 political parties would really have to think critically about what is important when it comes to good governance and administration of the state, and ensuring that at some point it may require, for the sake of good governance, or rather for the sake of just managing government to some degree, relinquish some of their own political identical issues, or maybe not even political identical issues, but just their own policies from party level, because it is some sort of a shared government, right? And so my hope is that this new arrangement would improve how the government does. So the question to then ask is that in the past, did coalition government, in particularly on local municipality, improve service delivery? If the answer is yes, then that's easy. We can work with that. And if the answer is no, then the follow-up question to answer is that then what do we do to ensure that this new form of governance is one that benefits South Africans? And I think this is the work that political parties are to do. But when it comes to accountability, I think this may just be a good thing for us, because then 10 political parties are governing the state in a form of a shared collaborative governance. And I see these political parties being able to really expose some of the rot that we saw there. And the DA, as the second opposition party in South Africa, has been saying that while we are in government with the ANC must also remember that we are to hold them accountable. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Ellen, as I move from this coalition government idea, is this idea of political parties that really contributed in the independence, particularly in South Africa with the ANC. I think we what we saw in South Africa and what we see now in South Africa, particularly with these elections, is two type of voters, as I mentioned earlier: the legacy voter and the issue-based voter. And so a lot of young voters, or not even just young voters, are starting to ask the question about who actually is interested in what we want to see. So people are moving from just voting for a party, offering their vote as a legacy vote because of the idea of independence, but identifying political parties that represent their interest. And I think opposition parties really need to work hard to when they campaign, and even when they think about their manifestos, because what we see in South Africa is that opposition parties, at the core of their narrative, is exposing how the ANC has not been able to meet the needs of its citizens, and rather than offering an alternative to citizens to say, this is what we are to offer you. And I think if we think about a party like the EFF, for example, that has been around for some time, a new party like MKP that was established in November last year, was able to take a lot of the votes from South Africans. So now they are the second opposition party, and the EFF has now moved to the third. And so we are in a political landscape where really we recognizing that, the single dominance idea is not working. We're exploring viable alternatives. Are the viable alternatives there? Perhaps the fact that there was no party that had the single majority that's required to govern, that on its own speaks to the fact that it's really difficult to now offer our votes to one party. Thank you.
Thank you. As an academia, a person who is doing a lot of scholarly work, do you think we are likely going to see this trend maybe spreading across Africa, or you think that it's a unique position that South Africa is in? What do you think? And I also want you to touch a bit on the if you said the coalition government and the local authority, in your view, they've been working because of enhanced transparency and accountability. So are we going to see one of the parties in the coalition government being swallowed, or we're going to see them coming out of this coalition come the next election being much stronger than they were before? What do you think? I want you to give us more like an academic perspective on this one. Over to you.
You're putting me under pressure here, Helen. I think one of the things that we must mention is that South Africa is not an exception. We've seen coalition governments in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, in Lesotho, which other country in Africa? Nigeria. But I think what we see in South Africa is different. And I said earlier that we saw coalition governments in local municipalities, and they had not worked well. So what I was suggesting in terms of the fact that they could work, this idea of collaborative governance on national level, right? So we are all hopeful that it could work. But historically, since 2016 and 2021, they've not done very well. The city of Johannesburg at the moment has close to, we've had about 7 mayors within the space of 4 years or 5 years since 2016. And that speaks to the instability of coalition governments. But while we recognize that coalition governments are sensitive and can cause instability, they also could provide an opportunity for robust democracy, right? And that idea I mentioned earlier, that then we are able to hold each other accountable. But I think it's also important to mention that we form coalition because it's an election outcome strategy. So it will depend how the election outcome in different countries look like. I mean, I think in Kenya it was an issue of the post-election conflict that happened in 2018, and Kofi Annan suggested, look, to bring stability in Kenya, let's think about coalition governments, multi-party arrangement to bring stability. But I think at a core that the act of forming coalition governments it's essentially because of election outcomes. My personal view of this is that while they are unstable and while they are a difficult art to manage, I think they can provide us with an opportunity here to build a new form of a robust democracy of some sort.
Thank you. Let me move quickly to the question on our chats from Beryl Nelima. She's asking that in the case of Burkina Faso, the people seem to have embraced military leadership. Is the desire for democratic processes waning? I think that is directed to Ibrahim or Aisha, but probably Ibrahim first and maybe Aisha.
So I think maybe I can give a shot at answering the question. One of the things that we saw, and I think the whole world saw it in many of these countries after these unconstitutional changes of government, was there was a lot of jubilation in the streets, and I think this was as a result of what was perceived as the failure of democracy to provide what I would call economic dividends, or to improve the lives of the citizens. And increasingly, in some of these countries, especially using a lot of anti-imperialist rhetoric, it seems like a lot of citizens are happy with having military regimes in place of democratic governments. But the question for me is whether a military administration or a military regime actually gives you those freedoms that you get within a democracy. We see in Burkina Faso, for instance, where citizens are forcefully conscripted to go and fight at the front lines, and you do not have a choice whether to fight some sort of insurgency or some sort of internal war or not. Democracy, of course, is not perfect, and it has its own flaws. However, it is still the best form of government because it gives citizens the right to choose. It protects a lot of your rights. You do not have to be conscripted into the army and so many other things. But I believe that it's very important that civil society organizations work in those spaces in very difficult circumstances, I must add, to also increase the levels of civic education to understand why democracy is a more preferable system of government. But I'll also defer to Aisha to also provide some insights.
Okay, so Aisha, if you can quickly touch on that and also respond to the question about how nations with disputed boundaries like Mauritania and West Sahara and Somaliland have or will navigate elections this year. That's mouthful, but I'm sure you can touch a bit on those issues from Honorable Spencer or Diambo.
Okay, just to continue on what Ibrahim has said, I will add that the need for civic education, as he said, and as an organization, we are doing research on the democratic systems that existed in Africa before colonialism. And because there's sometimes this misconception that the way democracy functions comes from the West, while maybe the word might come, but in African cultures and communities, they had, approaches and concepts that can be brought into modern day, the three structured governance system, and adapted to. And I would add, it's not the failure of, as I said earlier, it's not a failure of democracy. It's a failure of in which democracy was being implemented in these countries. And not everyone that jubilated after the coup is still supporting them. That's another one, because everyone, actually, people are being silenced for speaking their opinion or expressing their basic human rights, and that's a concern. Mauritania held its elections. Mauritania, I can speak on Mauritania because that's the one I'm more familiar with. It's a very, when it comes to who is a Mauritanian or who is not, is a very challenging issue that has been going on for decades. And this has to do with the fact that there's some people that are still considered as slaves. And after the Mauritania-Senegal crisis, there were people, because of the skin color they had, were expelled from their own country to Senegal, and they did return, couldn't find their lands, have difficulties having a nationality. There are people, actually adults or even grandparents, who are operating and living in Mauritania are Mauritanians, but they can't have national identification. So this is a very, very difficult topic for the people there and the authorities. It's a complex country. We have programs in the country, and we always try to navigate the social difficulties that exist in doing civil society work in a very divided country, where people are more focused on what's the color of your skin and in which ethnic group you belong to. The elections, I think everyone followed, was very tense. There's one thing to comment. This is the second time, or I would say the first time, because the previous president, Aziz, actually, he came through a coup, got elected, got re-elected, then transferred the power to the current president. So this is the second time that there is a peaceful, in quote, change of election that happens when someone has been elected. So again, there is this situation of countries that have drawn to military rule and dictatorship have difficulties getting out of that and being able to live into it. You cannot talk about elections or governance issues in Mauritania without tackling the issue of race and ethnicity, and that's very
Okay.
difficult.
Okay. Thank you. I think to Ihon, I think that's a subject that maybe we can discuss some other day, specifically on issues of boundaries in those countries and the issues of ethnicity vis-a-vis elections. Allow me to ask Ain to respond to a question from Lovejoy on Rwanda. He's saying that in terms of the media freedoms, how free was the media during the election time? Because too often he's saying he reads about all positive news during the Rwandese elections. Is it all that good that is it all that good, or there is suppression of some electoral irregularities? So Ain, if you can quickly respond to that. I think my panelists, if you can also check the questions in the chat so that you start preparing. I'll be calling upon you to also respond so that we finish all the questions before we close. And over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. In terms of the media freedom, what we saw was, if I may put it this way, it is only one broadcasting station, and which is the national broadcaster. And in a typical African country, being the national broadcaster, you are more of the mouthpiece of the regime at that particular time. So in Rwanda, in terms of the media freedom, I wouldn't say it is curtailed, nor is it oppressed, but people in Rwanda have found a way to, for lack of a better word, to censor themselves in terms of what
Okay.
comes out of their mouths, in terms of what they report out there. Is it a good thing for them? Maybe it works out. But for other people, like people in Kenya, who, for us, we enjoy the media freedom, we feel like people are being suppressed. But when you go there and you talk to around this, they tell you our media is free, our media is objective, and that's exactly how it is because it is controlled by the ruling government. But also remember, in terms of the opposition politics in Rwanda is so minimal, if I may put it that way. So you cannot even start gauging and saying that you're measuring it to what? If you're measuring it to Rwanda, it is fine with them. But if you're measuring it with the region, that's a different ballgame, as it were. But in the case of the media freedom, we saw the the media trying to project as much as possible and also saying as it were on the ground, which was the actual fact, as it were.
So was there fair media coverage of the opposition and the incumbents in your analysis and observation? With that one state media, how was the opposition covered?
A non-state media opposition, it's actually non-existent, if I may put it that way. And if you look, there were only three candidates for presidential. And the support base for these people was so minimal, apart from President Kagame, the support base was so minimal. So even in terms
Okay.
of the media coverage, it was more of a, I would put it as a footnote down there. The president Kagame was the one who was given more of the limelight, but also it
Okay.
speaks because of the support base. Yeah.
I think that answers the person who has asked that question. So to Nigeria, quickly, just to respond to the question that how effective is collaboration between civic society and the NEC, the Electoral Commission, in ensuring free and fair elections, whether in the national elections, the local authority. We just want to know the relationship between the two institutes. So if you can quickly respond to that, Ibrahim, over to you.
Thank you so much. So there has been collaboration between civil society organizations and our election management body, which is known as the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC. While the election management body has a budget, for instance, for voter education, if I remember correctly, only about 1% of the election management body's budget, 1% of the entire budget is for voter education activities. So civil society organizations have a very important role to play, stepping in and filling in that gap when it comes to voter education, for instance. And because voter education is such a wide gamut of many things, when there's an introduction of new technologies, for instance, when there are new processes involved in Sierra Leone, for instance, we saw a reversal to what was known as the proportional representation system instead of a first past the post system that was used previously. Civil society have a role in playing all of that. It have a role in playing doing things like that, even when it comes to building trust, for instance, because across election management bodies, not only in Nigeria, but from a lot of the elections that I've witnessed across the continent, there's an erosion of trust, public trust in election management bodies. And civil society organizations have resources, have capacity, have a voice, have a presence within various communities, and they can leverage all of these resources to collaborate towards ensuring free and fair, credible elections. But just finally to say that many times free and fair, credible elections are a stretch. But if we can say free and fair elections are a stretch, if we can say we have credible elections, an election that truly reflects, despite the challenges, because even the best of elections have their own challenges. But if we can say that these elections are credible enough and truly reflect the will of the citizens who have gone out to vote on election day, I think it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I also think that as Yaga Africa, I think we also have direct programs that you do with the Electoral Commission, if you can confirm. And I think in addition to what you're saying, it also depends if the EMB is welcoming civic society or wants to collaborate or complement the work of civic society, or vice versa, civic society complementing the work of the EMB. But that relationship, I think, is it's needed for checks and balances, as well as just to enhance programming activities that are targeting the citizens. So thank you for that response. There is another question. So the last one is just a comment, I think, to N. I don't think anyone to answer that from William. Why does Kagame fear a strong opposition? I think that one is, I don't know whether I want to answer, but I don't think you should. And then Lovejoy again, there's a question to Aisha. Lovejoy saying, in the context of West Africa evolving democratic landscape, how you view the balance between maintaining public order and protecting citizens' rights to freely express political frustrations. What are the key challenges civic society faces in advocating for these freedoms, and how can governments ensure peaceful dissent is supported rather than suppressed? I think in respect to doing demonstrations or doing some actions towards any form of suppression in a country. So Aisha, if you can just quickly touch on that, and when you finish, respond to that question, give us your parting shots, and I'll do the same for all the panelists. Over to you,
Thank
Aisha,
you. So
in 1
quickly,
minute.
yeah,
Mhm.
2 minutes. It's difficult to navigate security and freedom, especially in countries, like Burkina, Mali, who have the insecurity with organized group wreaking havoc, and even in northern Nigeria. But this is something that comes with governing, actually. So the government should ensure that they protect the basic rights of peaceful protest, and when they protest, actually, the security forces who are trained to de-escalate any violence that might happen without hampering on, on people's rights. There should be space actually for constructive criticism and allow dissent to happen, because that contributes to, reinforcing or building the country. And also some of our laws actually, and when it comes to freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, what I call in French loi bateau, which are like, they're like ships. You don't necessarily know what's inside, but it's global. It has to be more detailed and clear in countries that have to deal with this. When it comes to challenges for civil society, you have restricted access to public spaces, you have crackdowns, you have being perceived as an opposition, actually, just because you are trying to, stand your ground and doing what's right. And one of the ways that government can help, there needs to be continued discussion between law enforcement authorities, government, and CSO to make sure that there clear guidelines that are put in place, and that everyone understands, to make sure that freedoms are preserved. So when it comes to my parting words, I want to thank Ahon for organizing this session, which gives a cross-cutting, view on what's happening in every other country, and also for the great questions that have been asked by the participant. It shows the interest they have in, moving the continent, forward. And thank you, everyone. And I'll just encourage civil society organizations and youth organizations to continue pushing despite the different challenges they're facing in the different, very crazy environment sometimes that they have to operate in. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Aisha. I'll move to Ibrahim. Your parting shots and maybe 3 recommendations to the different stakeholders in this webinar.
Thank you so much. I think I'll follow from my big sister Aisha. Say thank you for putting this together. We've seen a lot of diversity across the continent in terms of the panelists and the those who have joined in as well. We talk about 2024 a lot, and for us, 2024 is the election year. It's the year where the highest number of citizens across the world are going to go and cast a ballot or 2 or more for an elected leader, for the elected leaders. And with everything that we see across the world, whether democracy is delivering on economic development or not, and sometimes we've also seen where democracy has been regressing. I think it's important, my final words, especially to citizens, especially to young African citizens, is not to give up hope on democracy, because we can see that democracy has the promise to deliver on the dividends and improving the standards of life that we want to see. But it's not going to happen by its own. We must organize, we must advocate, we must put in the work, we must hold our leaders accountable. And so as we discuss some of the challenges that we've seen across the continent moving forward, I think the first step is to participate in the electoral process. That's one of the ways that we can get involved. But beyond that is how can we hold our leaders accountable for the promises they made before the elections and continue to strengthen our democratic practice across the continent.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you so much for the interesting insights. I will move quickly to Bonolo for your parting shots. But in particular, I think I need 2 recommendations to the different stakeholders in this meeting. Then we'll go to Anne.
Thank you, Ellen. I just want to build onto something that both Aisha and Ibrahim mentioned earlier, this idea of credible elections, and particularly in the conversation around unconstitutional changes of government. I think, even the framing sometimes is something that we may need to interrogate, because we are operating on the premises that the government itself was established constitutionally, right?
Yeah.
And so for a government to be established constitutionally and to be perceived as credible, of course we must vote, elections must take place. But this does not necessarily mean that in most parts of this continent the elections have been credible. So I think one of the things that I think electoral management bodies need to really, pay attention to, but also civil society in holding electoral management bodies and states accountable, is strengthening weak institutions. So we have seen that the electoral management bodies, to some degree, have been very weak, and this is why, we've got cases where elections are rigged and so on and so forth. So we must not wait for the military to take over. We must not wait to see political instability and that has multiple layers to it in terms of even peace and security in Africa. We must really interrogate ways in which we strengthen institutions that are to protect democracy and promote accountability and transparency. But on a more hopeful side, as with what has been happening in Kenya, in Nigeria, and in other parts of this continent, particularly in how young people are demanding justice. There's something here that I think we also need to pay particular attention to, is this strange relationship that the government has with citizens, right? And in ways in which governments also respond to citizens demanding justice. It's quite bizarre that we see the levels of police brutality that we saw in Kenya. I mean, the many young people that lost their lives in Kenya, there was no need for that. People that lost their lives in Nigeria in 2020, there was no need for that. So I think we really need to think critically about this idea of how states engage with those that are demanding justice, and the strange relationship that we must, governments now are using force when people are exercising their fundamental rights of association and assembly, even freedom of expression on online platforms. But on a more local level, I really think that there is a shift. Something is happening on this continent. Something I remember when the protest was happening in Kenya, I was talking to a Kenyan friend of mine, and she was saying to me, as much as she laments and she's heartbroken of what is happening in Kenya, but she's also hopeful that there's a shift and there's something happening. And of course, I would like to see us come to a point where this shift does not have to result in other people losing their lives. So yeah, I think really we also need to think about very creative and innovative ways of building democracy, even outside of these spaces that are advocacy space and academia space. How do we bring the place of art and media as well in building democracy? I remember in 2022 December, Ellen, I was in
You need to wind up, my dear.
I'm gonna wind up now.
Okay.
I was in Harare, and I went to Winky D's concert, and where he released that song Zimbabwe that speaks to democracy, right? And I think those are some of the creative ways that we also need to explore in how, when we think about building strong movements and building democracy, we must take them outside of our classrooms. We must take them outside of these kind of organized civil society spaces and think about where's the place of art and media to help us really reimagine an Africa that contradicts our current reality.
Wow, thank you. Excellent recommendations there. And just to buttress what you have said, maybe to also include intergovernmental organizations, the government, to ensure that they also strengthen the institutions in African countries, especially our RECs. I think they also have a role to play in strengthening institutions. Allow me to call N. N, there's a question for you. I don't know whether you want to answer that. Why does Kagame fear strong opposition candidates? And then give me 3 recommendations, your parting shots, and then we wind up in 1 minute. You are muted, my dear. Okay.
Thank you, Ellen. Sorry about that. I'm saying, let me not answer the question because I'm not that one. I'm just about it. In terms of the recommendations and the ones that I can have, let me put it across where
I don't
I
know whether
understand.
it's me, Anne, or I can hardly hear you. I think you have changed your position. Yeah, I can hardly hear you.
And now,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yeah, it's better.
All right. Okay. So I'm saying, let me put the recommendations across for the civil society, the space I'm in. We
Mhm.
need to rethink how we are doing our elections, be it observation, be it monitoring, be it electoral assistance, for that matter. Because we have an electorate that was no longer there or was not there previously, and the playing field has changed. The politicians are the same, but the actors in terms of the stakeholders, these are the new voters, if I may put it that way. They are the new kids on the block. So if we do not realign how we do our programming, then we will have a root shock when it comes, especially for Kenya, 2027 elections, be it Uganda in 2026, or our neighbors in Tanzania who are doing the elections in 2025. Looking at it also, how are we looking at our funding methods? Who are our funders? Who are funding the processes and what processes are being funded? That is a conversation that maybe also should start now when we are talking to the donors or the development partners. It is for us to craft a way that this development partnership will come to fruition and will be of great advantage to the people that we work with in the community and also in the society. Then the third one is also for us as elected observers. The terrain has changed. We know it is, we keep on saying electoral observation is purposeful gathering of information, but is it also only information? Because we have AI, the technology has completely changed, and if we can take a good example of the American election and the role that AI is playing, then we cannot sit and wait for the next election cycle over and over the same way and expect different results. It is us get out of our comfort zone, get out of the norms that we are used to, do things differently, and embrace the technological approaches that are coming. Then I believe with that, we can be able to have successful electoral observation, electoral assistance, monitoring.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne, for that. Colleagues, we have come to the end of our webinar where we're discussing the opportunities and challenges in African elections in 2024. And we discussed countries like Chad, Comoros, Mauritania, Rwanda, Senegal, South Africa, Burkina Faso, and so forth. So we really want to thank you for listening. But may I call upon the coordinator of IHON, Ilog Mule, to give us the closing remarks. Over to you, Mule.
Thank you very much, Ellen. This is Marcus. Mule is making a presentation, so apologies
It's
for that.
okay. It's
All right.
okay.
So, for the purposes of everyone else, my name is Marcus. I'm the programs coordinator here at ELOG EON. And my work is just simply to thank everyone, starting with our audience that have been keenly listening, keenly following the information that is being shared, that have been participating in the conversation. Also to thank the panel members that created time and their own resources to be in this forum, and to also thank you, Helen, for agreeing to moderate the sessions. We know that elections are a cornerstone of our democracy, and as such is of public interest. So elections that are happening in any part of the country, any part of the continent, becomes a business not only of those members of those countries, but also for the region and also for the global community. And so we take elections very seriously, and we hope that lessons that we have learned the challenges that we have been able to identify, then inform our strategies as the actors in the space, as well as inform our lobbying and advocacy for good governance through elected democracy. So once again, thanks to the team here at EON, ELOG, Ian, and the team for supporting this process. And on behalf of the East and Horn of Africa Election Observation Network, EON, we thank everyone for creating time. We thank everybody for participating, and we look forward to future engagements. We'll be able to share this report, the audios, with everyone else in this forum, but also even our publics to be able to follow the conversations as they happen today. Thank you very much, and over to you, Ellen.
Thank you once again to Elog Eon. I also thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I think our technical team can now end the webinar. Thank you. Over to you, the technical team, Ian.